Welcome to my series of podcasts about the stories of the Tudors and Stuarts. My name's Tony Riches and I'm a historical fiction author from Pembrokeshire in Wales. And this podcast continues my Elizabethan series, looking at the world of an amazing Elizabethan woman, Lady Frances Walsingham, the subject of my book, Frances, Tudor Countess. I'd been planning an Elizabethan series for some time, as my aim was to tell the stories of the Tudors from Owen Tudor's first meeting with Queen Catherine of Valois, right through to the death of Queen Elizabeth I, and lead into the succession and rise of the Stuarts. I decided to show the fascinating world of the Elizabethan court through the eyes of the Queen's favourite courtiers, and I chose Frances as she had an unusual relationship with her Queen through her father, Sir Francis Walsingham. Can you imagine living in a world where nothing is quite what it seems? A letter might contain a secret message, a visitor might not be who he claims to be, and an innocent-looking piece of paper could contain information worth a man's life. This was the world into which Frances Walsingham was born, because her father was Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth I's principal secretary and creator of the most sophisticated intelligence network in 16th century Europe, and the man history remembers as the Queen's spymaster. Frances Walsingham was born around 1567, and sadly she was the only surviving child of Sir Francis Walsingham and his second wife, Ursula St Barbe. Her father was a committed Protestant and spent part of Queen Mary's reign in exile abroad, only returning to England after Queen Elizabeth's accession. In August 1572, as a 5-year-old child living in Paris while her father served as ambassador, Frances survived the deadly St Bartholomew's Day massacre, and her family became a sanctuary for fleeing Protestants. And her childhood instilled in her an absolute sense of discretion and a fluent command of French and Italian. As she grew into a young woman, her father transformed his London estate into an intelligence hub. Queen Elizabeth's state intelligence wasn't run out of a palace, it was run out of their family home, and Frances quite likely served as her father's unofficial confidential secretary. She was one of the few people he could absolutely trust with state secrets. Frances is usually remembered for something else. She was the wife of the warrior poet Sir Philip Sidney, and then she became the wife of Robert Devereaux, Earl of Essex, and finally the wife of Richard de Burgh, the Earl of Clanricarde. 3 husbands and 3 political worlds, and a life spanning the final decades of Elizabeth's reign and the opening years of the Stuart age. Yet before she became Lady Sidney, Countess of Essex and Countess of Clanricarde, she was something more intriguing, the daughter of the man who knew everyone's secrets. He came increasingly important to the Queen's government, and by 1573 was serving as one of her principal secretaries. His intelligence network would eventually stretch across England into France and the Low Countries, Spain, and right down through Italy. And it depended on letters, informants, travelling merchants and diplomats, and intercepted correspondence. And he also had a network of double agents in all these countries, and it generated an extraordinary amount of paper. And Frances grew up in the middle of all of this. Although we can't prove her father trained her as a spy, he made sure she was better educated than most men, and as a child growing up in the Walsingham household, she would definitely understand the strange business surrounding her father's work. This was not a household where politics stopped at the front door, because foreign ambassadors came and went, secretaries worked over secret letters which arrived from abroad, messages had to be copied, deciphered, evaluated and passed perhaps even up to the Queen. And Walsingham's houses at Barn Elms and Seething Place by the Tower of London became places from which the Elizabethan government operated in strictest secrecy. The Elizabethans had a problem, though, in that letters could be intercepted, so they increasingly relied on Walsingham's codes and ciphers, where he replaced letters with other letters, numbers, and even symbols. So a message might appear to be meaningless unless you had the secret key. Walsingham's intelligence service became quite sophisticated, and it's tempting to imagine his young daughter Frances sitting beside her father, learning how to decipher his secret messages. There's no surviving evidence proving Frances worked as one of her father's codebreakers, but she did become a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth and was surrounded by influential people who were steeped in diplomacy, foreign languages, handling correspondence, and of course the political intrigue of the Elizabethan court. Frances belonged to a culture in which aristocratic women could handle these letters, manage accounts and household networks of correspondence. And there's another reason Frances is fascinating. Her father's intelligence network didn't consist entirely of men creeping through dark alleys with daggers. Much of the espionage was surprisingly ordinary, and information travelled through households, through servants and merchants, and women could therefore be very useful within the intelligence network because they were often underestimated or even invisible. A woman at court might overhear something that a counsellor could not. She might know who'd visited who was quarrelling, who'd suddenly come into a lot of money, and who'd been seeing foreign visitors. In 1583, Frances married one of the most celebrated young courtiers in England, Sir Philip Sidney. She was about 16 and he was 28, a famous soldier, courtier, diplomat, and more importantly, the court intellectual and poet. And the marriage caused a bit of a problem for Frances's father, as the Queen hadn't approved it. Philip Sidney was the nephew of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the Queen's favourite, and Sir Francis Walsingham was very closely associated with Leicester's Protestant circle. So the Queen may have worried that the marriage would strengthen an already influential faction at court. But the marriage went ahead, and Francis entered a new world of diplomacy, literature, and European affairs. In 1585, Frances gave birth to a daughter she named Elizabeth after the Queen, who agreed to be godmother. But Frances' first marriage would be short, as at the Battle of Zutphen on the 22nd of September 1586, Sir Philip Sidney was fatally wounded, and Frances was only about 19 and became a widow with a young daughter. By the 1580s, England and Spain were moving towards open conflict, and her father, Sir Francis Walsingham, needed information about the Spanish preparations, Catholic networks, their shipping, military intentions, and he had a network of exiles and spies providing information through diplomatic and commercial channels, much of it depending on correspondence. And then, of course, in 1588, the Spanish sent their armada. But Sir Francis Walsingham was ill, possibly with cancer, or some historians think it might have been gallstones. But the treatments for either were more likely to kill you than the illness. And he had to be cared for by his daughter Frances. And because she was completely trustworthy and fluent in various languages, she was able to help him with secret correspondence that he really couldn't risk showing to any of his other clerks. If Frances understood the conventions of her father's correspondence, she would have been really useful, even if all she did was recognise what was important. Then, in 1590, tragedy struck again, and Sir Francis Walsingham died. He'd spent a fortune of his own money supporting Queen Elizabeth's intelligence network, and in typical fashion, she had been very slow to recognise this or repay any of the money. And although he served the crown for years, he died in debt and was buried at midnight as he'd lived his life in secret. Then came another extraordinary chapter in that Francis married Robert Devereaux, the subject of my book, Essex Tudor Rebel. And the Earl of Essex was not only a favourite of the Queen, but he was one of the most powerful men at her court. And I like to think of him as the son she never had. So when he married Francis, the Queen was absolutely furious. Again, she hadn't given permission, and it took a long time before she forgave them. Robert Devereaux would eventually challenge the Queen, or more accurately, her advisers, who he said were corrupt, and attempt to overthrow the government. And sadly, his rebellion collapsed and Essex was executed at the Tower of London. But Francis survived all of this and adapted to the situation. And in 1603, she married for a third time. Her husband now was a chap called Richard de Burgh, the Earl of Clanricarde. And this marriage took her into an entirely different world, Ireland. And she would spend much of her remaining years travelling between England and Ireland with some dangerous sea crossings, and eventually becoming associated with the great houses of Summerhill in Kent and Portumna Castle in County Galway. And her third marriage also makes Frances even more interesting figure to understand, because she saw the transition from Tudor to Stuart England from a very privileged vantage point, and she'd been born during Elizabeth's reign, lived through the rise and fall of the Earl of Essex, and survived into the reign of King James I. Her life crossed the worlds of intelligence, diplomacy, literature, religion, war, and high politics, and she understood something that perhaps only someone raised in Sir Francis Walsingham's household could fully appreciate. Knowledge was power, and secrecy was survival. Here is a short excerpt from the audiobook edition of Frances Tudor Countess, narrated by Ruth Redman.
Walsingham House, 1590. Frances sits in the old wooden chair at her father's bedside and does her best to contain her annoyance with him. His doctors failed to find relief for his pain other than bitter-tasting physic medicines, which make him worse. He can no longer walk without help, but survived the harsh winter, and they hope he will improve with the onset of spring. You should not have travelled to the Palace of Westminster, father. Your doctors advised you to stay in bed for good reason. Her concern adds an edge to her voice. I heard you collapsed and had to be carried back in a litter. She gives him a disapproving look. I hope your meeting was worth it. His face is like parchment in the flickering candlelight, making his eyes seem even darker as he stares up at her. I had to attend a meeting of the Privy Council. If you must know, I'd asked them to discuss candidates for my replacement as Principal Secretary. I also delivered my state papers to Lord Burleigh for safekeeping. You are retiring? Francis had doubted he would even consider it, and the enormity of his decision takes a moment to sink in. This changes everything. I've had enough, Francis. Someone else can take on the unhappy task of telling the Queen what she does not wish to hear. Francis understands his bitterness. The Queen blamed her father for not telling her the facts of Drake's failed expedition the previous year, and treats him with disdain. The real culprit was General Norris, who hoped to save his own reputation at her father's expense. Every member of the Privy Council knew the truth, yet none spoke out in her father's defence. He struggles to sit up. I cannot remain in bed, Francis. He sounds frustrated. Will you help me to my desk? I have important matters to attend to. The doctors say you must rest. The doctors have no idea of the trouble I am in. He curses under his breath. If I cannot secure new loans, my creditors will seize this house and sell it from under me. His raised voice echoes in his sparsely furnished bedchamber. Then we shall sell more of your estates. Frances understands her father's dire finances and how the royal visit last summer exhausted his savings. As far as I know, you've never visited your lands in Wiltshire. The income from rents is needed to keep you and your mother after my days. Then I choose to sell, and Mother will agree we must put your affairs in order. I've not forgotten you inherited my late husband's debts. She tries to remain composed as the painful memory of Philip's last hours returns. I had no idea how indebted Philip Sidney had become, but I made a promise, Francis, which I have done my best to honour. He frowns. I'd planned to use Anthony Babington's forfeited estates, which the Queen granted to Walter Raleigh instead. I will never understand why. But in truth, I've never understood why our Queen acts as she does. He slumps back on his pillows as the pain strikes again. Francis stands. You must rest, Father. I will speak to your lawyers about selling the land and bring you the papers to sign. Beth wakes Francis at dawn. They'd been taking turns to sit at the bedside, and the worried look on her face in the dim light fills Francis with alarm. You asked me to tell you if your father's condition grew worse, my lady. Francis fights a growing sense of despair as she pulls on her clothes and follows Beth to her father's bedchamber. His doctors had told her to prepare herself for the inevitable, yet she prays every day for any sign of improvement. Her first thought when she sees her father is that she's too late. He lies on his back, his sunken eyes closed. But then she sees the slow rise and fall of his chest. She turns to Beth. Have you sent for his doctor? I thought to fetch you first, my lady. Frances stares at her father, unsure what to do. The doctor has been of little enough use to him, but send one of the servants and ask him to come as quickly as he can. A thought occurs to her. Also, wake one of the grooms and tell him to ride to Barn Elms and tell my mother we need her here. She sits in the chair at the side of his bed and listens to her father's halting breath, like the wheezing of an old pair of bellows. He'd suffered with pains in his left side for as long as she could remember. Although often melancholy, he rarely complains and soldiers on through a stubborn effort of will. Frances reaches out and takes his hand in hers. He's grown so thin she feels the bones under the skin. She remembers how proud he'd been on her wedding day and his delight to see little Elizabeth's first steps. He'd been devastated by Philip's death, but had still found the strength to help her through her grief. Her father deserved better reward for his years of loyal service to the Queen, but never sought a title. He'd told her that even now the Queen refused to discuss his replacement or acknowledge that his debts were incurred in her service. Frances vows to find a way to make the vindictive Queen pay for her cruel treatment of her most loyal servant. His eyes flicker open, and he looks up at her. She leans forward and kisses him on the cheek. I've sent for Mother, and the doctor will be here soon. Thank you, Francis. His voice is a whisper, and the effort of talking takes the last of his energy. He lies back and closes his eyes, and his breathing gradually slows before stopping altogether. The house falls silent. Frances feels his hand go limp in hers, sensing her father is finally at peace. A tear runs down her cheek, and she surrenders to her grief. She's never told her father how much she loves him, and now it is too late. Frances immerses herself in the challenge of sorting out her father's affairs. She starts by unlocking the hidden desk drawer in his study and spreads out the contents on his desk. Unsealed, but witnessed by their elderly family lawyer, his last will and testament is brief, and begins with a poignant request. "In hope of a joyful resurrection, I wish to be buried without any extraordinary ceremonies, as usually appertain to a man serving in my place, in respect of the greatness of my debts, and the mean state I shall leave my wife and heir in." She wipes away a tear. Her father had his wish, as he'd somehow arranged for friends to carry him away at midnight to bury him in an unmarked grave close to Philip Sidney in the Cathedral of St. Paul's. His plan makes it harder for Frances and her mother to move on with their grieving, but now at least she knows it was what he wanted. He has left her £300 a year, more than enough for her modest needs. Everything else, including Walsingham House and Barn Elms, is left to her mother. Frances guesses her father's creditors will make life difficult for them now her father is gone. A hammering at the door breaks through her reverie and sets the dogs barking. Beth knocks and opens the door. "Master Robert Cecil has come with a team of men." She frowns. "He says he has a warrant to undertake a search and remove your father's papers, my lady." Frances glances at the letters and papers she'd spread out on her father's desk and makes a quick decision. "Tell Robert Cecil I will only be a moment, Beth." As soon as Beth closes the door, she looks around her father's study for a suitable hiding place. There hasn't been time to see what else he'd locked in his drawer, but for good reason they were not among the papers he'd delivered to Lord Burleigh for safekeeping. Frances removes a few of her father's old books from a shelf and puts the papers in the space behind. She replaces the books and locks his last will and testament back in the desk drawer, dropping the key into the hidden pocket of her dress. There is no need to make Robert Cecil's task easier for him. After a last glance around her father's study, she finds him waiting in the hall with half a dozen men. He removes his hat and bows. "I offer my sincere condolences on the loss of your father, my lady." He glances at the men behind him. "I'm sure you understand the need to ensure the safety of any confidential papers, and I have a warrant to make a search of the house." Frances takes a deep breath. She understands, but resents the intrusion. At least there is no longer any question of Robert Cecil having feelings for her. He'd surprised everyone by marrying an attractive young courtier, Elizabeth Brooke, the daughter of Sir William Brooke, Baron Cobham. She tries to keep her tone civil. "All I ask is that your men take care with our property. My father delivered his state papers to your father, so there is little enough to do." A thought occurs to her. "Does this mean you are taking over from my father?" "My father is acting as Secretary of State until Her Majesty makes a permanent appointment. I offered to assist him, as he has plenty to keep him occupied." He nods to his men, who start their work in the cellars. Frances knows Robert Cecil is thorough, and they will discover her father's will in his secret drawer, but hopes the other papers he had locked away will elude them. She is curious about what they might be, and will study them after Cecil and his men are gone.
My next podcast will be looking at the amazing life of another of the Queen's ladies, Bess, Tudor gentlewoman, the wife of Sir Walter Raleigh. And my book, Frances Tudor Countess, is available from Amazon in paperback, audiobook and ebook, and more information about all my books can be found on my website at tonyriches.com. Thank you for listening.
The daughter of the shadow-weaving sire, whose secret ink did guard the English crown, now walks a maze of sorrow and desire, where rising stars are broken and cast down. First fell her Sidney on the bloody field, a noble knight whom cruel death did claim. Then rebel Essex to the axe did yield, leaving a scarred and treason-tainted name.
Yet through the ash of every fallen lord, the weeping lady stands in silent grace,
A prize of peace